All right, good evening and welcome. My name is Philip McElman and I'm the chair of the economics department here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which tonight's lecture will take place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Okay, tonight's lecture is the Corden Public Lecture, and it's in honour of Max Corden, one of Australia's most influential and important economists. Sadly, Max is no longer with us. He passed away October last year, but his legacy lives on, not just in this public lecture, but through his students and through his writing as well. So I'd like to now invite Simon Corden just to share his reflections with us.
Good evening. Last night I went back to check which was the last Corden lecture that Max attended, and it was 2019, and Max was as witty and lucid at 91 as he introduced Paul Krugman with aplomb. Unfortunately tonight you've got the lesser Corden, but as an economist I know how well he was loved across the profession and how sorely missed he is since his death under a year ago. Max loved economics, he loved his students, he loved lectures such as this, and he loved the support he received here from so many of his colleagues. He had a special affection for Melbourne Uni at University of Melbourne. It bookended his career. He started his economics studies here and he finished here as an emeritus, still publishing at the age of 90. I know he would be extremely pleased that this lecture is in his honour and now his memory continues, and I'd like to thank all of those from University of Melbourne for making this possible. So thank you again for continuing this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. This is a very special Corden lecture because it is the first since Max has passed. And it does seem fitting that tonight's eminent speaker, Dr. Mary Amiti, is sort of coming in and talking to us. She shares a lot of overlap with Max. She grew up in Melbourne, just like Max, and she received her PhD from the London School of Economics, just like Max. And her chosen field is international economics, just like Max. But there are a couple of other just like Max things as well. She did work here at the University of Melbourne in the Department of Economics for a while, so we're lucky enough to have her here. But then she also has worked at the International Monetary Fund as well, so that also is a common theme that sort of echoes the experience of Max. And you kind of find that when you look at her writings as well, it has very many overlaps with Max. And tonight's lecture will pick up some of those threads, and that's not because she sort of engineered things to look or reflect the interests of Max, but it is in fact something I think that all Australian trade economists have, is this sense that Max has really led the way and did spotlight a lot of the key issues that are perennial issues, the things that we keep coming back to time and time again, and having to sort of reiterate and reinforce the messages and lessons that Max taught us. Mary, as it says on the slide, is the head of the labour market and product market studies in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's not as I mentioned, that's not the only appointment she's held. She has also held appointments at La Trobe University, Pompeo Fabra, and also the World Bank. So like Max, she's been fairly sort of peripatetic. She's been around the place and drawn lots of influences and shared her knowledge with lots of people. And tonight, I'd like to invite her to share some of that knowledge with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Mary.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honour to be here. As mentioned, I have strong links to Melbourne. Even though I've lived in the US for more than 20 years, I still consider myself a Melburnian. I grew up here, I studied here, and most of my family lives here. So, you know, I'm always looking for reasons to come back. And it's especially an honor to give this Max Corden lecture because, because of my great admiration for Max. I met Max more than a couple of decades ago, and the first thing that struck me about him was just how much interest he showed in other people, and the curiosity he showed. And then I was here a few years ago and gave a lecture at Melbourne University, and he attended my lecture, and he asked lots of insightful questions, and then continued grilling me during lunch. So it's just a real pleasure to be here. Even in his 90s, he was just as was mentioned, very, very, very sharp. I'd like to, I'll begin the lecture. So first of all, I have to start with the usual disclaimer, because I'm at the Federal Reserve, that the views I'm going to express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank. In this talk, I'm going to be talking about the winners and losers from the U.S. China trade war. So the U.S. China trade war, let me just start off by telling you a bit about it. I'm sure most of you, all of you have heard about it. But the U.S. levied import tariffs of 10 to 50% on more than $300 billion worth of imports from China. And during that period, China retaliated with very high tariffs of their own on US exports. So while I'm going to focus on the 2018-19 US-China trade war, I just want to emphasize that it has much broader implications. So firstly, it wasn't just China that was hit by these high tariffs. There were other countries as well. But I'm sure most of you have read the two presidential candidates in the US are, proposing new rounds of tariffs. Former President Trump is proposing 10% tariff across the board of all imports, an additional 60% tariff on Chinese imports, and 100% tariffs on foreign cars, including those from Mexico, who we have a free trade agreement with. President Biden, when he came into power, he didn't dismantle any of the tariffs that were imposed. And he's also proposing new rounds of tariffs, 25% on Chinese steel, tariffs on electrical vehicles, and steep tariffs on many other products. What I want to emphasize is that, these tariffs are very broad-ranging, and it's not just about the past, but they're here and likely to increase. So it's important that we try to understand what the impacts are of these tariffs. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about what are the costs and benefits of these tariffs, what are the objectives of imposing these tariffs, and were these objectives achieved? Did the US economy actually benefit from having these tariffs? Who were the losers from the tariffs, and were there any winners? So I'm going to start off just kind of giving you kind of a conceptual framework of what we might expect the costs and benefits of a tariff to be, and then we'll go into looking at the evidence to see what actually happened. So since I'm going to be mentioning tariffs over and over again, I just want to start off to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about. So basically, a tariff is just a tax on imports, and it's usually expressed as a percent of the import value. So 10%, 20%. Some of them were 50%, and some of them, now they're being proposed 100% of the value. So the consumer pays that amount, the amount of the tariff rate times the value of the imports, and the government collects that as part of its revenue. So this is just basically a transfer of money from consumers to the government, just like any other tax. But tariffs can also hurt firms and consumers by distorting their consumption and production decisions. So just to fix ideas, let's take an example that, let's say a Chinese car costs $30,000 and a price of an American car is $35,000. So the consumer may decide to, before the tariff is imposed, to buy the cheaper Chinese car. But if the US imposes, say, a 20% tariff and the price of the Chinese car increases to $36,000, then the consumer might say, okay, now that's too expensive, I'm going to buy the US car. So this is then distorting the consumption decision of the consumers to buy the American car. What are the benefits of the tariffs? Well, one idea out there is that, perhaps if we impose that tariff on China, China might reduce the price of its exports. And this is what the economists refer to as the terms of trade gain. So if China, let's say we impose a 20% tariff on China, and it reduces its price by 20%, then the tariff-inclusive price for the consumer is the same, but the government collects the tariff revenue. And I think this was the hope when the tariffs were imposed during the trade war. And then one of the main objectives that usually, stated objectives by politicians usually is that it will expand employment and production. It's there to protect the domestic industry. So, as we said in this case, if the tariff-inclusive price of Chinese goods is higher, then, the idea is that, consumers will shift to the domestic car, and this protection will then expand employment and production. But it's not necessarily the case that will happen. The US producers might decide they'll just increase their profit margins instead of expanding production. This is what we often refer to as the markup effect. Alternatively, consumers might say, well, no, we're not going to actually shift to US cars, but we might shift to another low-cost foreign supplier. For example, they might shift to Vietnam to VinFast cars. I did have to look that up, but yes, they produce cars that are called VinFast, and they may be cheaper than the US cars. So even if the objective is to expand employment, it's not necessarily the case that will happen, and so we really need to turn to the evidence to see what actually did happen. Okay, so now I want to turn to Max Corden's insight. Max argued that the tariffs can actually cause the domestic industry to shrink instead of the expansion that we were expecting. So to understand why this might happen, what he emphasized is that we need to distinguish between tariffs on inputs from those on outputs. So far, we've been talking about the tariffs on outputs, like the tariff on cars. And that's what we were saying would provide protection to the car industry. But the US tariffs were actually largely levied on intermediate inputs, like steel, semiconductors, auto parts. So what does that do? Well, that's going to increase the cost to produce a car in the US. And so that's going to make the US car producers less competitive, and they're going to have to compete with other foreign exporters like from Japan that don't have tariffs on their inputs, new tariffs. So it's not necessarily the case that that tariffs will protect the industry. And Max's main point was that we need to keep track of these tariffs on inputs and outputs when we're assessing their impact. The tariffs on the output, like the cars, that can help the domestic firms, either by allowing them to expand production and employment or increasing their profit margins. But the tariffs on the inputs hurt them, so because it increases the cost of producing. So whether the US firm is going to benefit from tariffs really depends on the net effect, and this is what Max referred to as the effective rate of protection. So this is a key insight that is often overlooked in terms of trying to assess the impact. Okay, so now let me turn to the data. So I just want to give you kind of a quick overview of what happened in the trade war. As I said, the Trump administration imposed very high tariffs on more than $300 billion of US imports, and the average tariff rate on Chinese imports increased from about 3% to 18%. So what is this graph I've got here? So the vertical axis is just the average tariff, and then what I'm indicating is the different waves of the tariffs that were introduced by the US. So this tariff is like the average across all products, not just Chinese imports. So as you see, at the beginning of the trade war, the average tariff in the US was very, very low. It's about 1.5%. And then the trade war really started early 2018 with tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, and followed by steel and aluminium on a few countries, but then extended also onto Canada and Mexico, among other countries. And it wasn't until about July of 2018 where the tariffs were then just targeted at on China. So the earlier tariffs were a little broader on other countries. And those first tranches of tariffs on China, they were almost all on intermediate inputs. It was only like later on that they started also putting tariffs on final goods. So we really need to keep that in mind. So this is a similar graph, but it just goes back to 1990, just to show you that we were actually on this downward trajectory of reducing tariffs, even though they were already fairly low on average. I mean, there were some products that were pretty high, but just then in 2 years, you can see that there was this big reversal of tariffs, average tariffs. Okay, well, that was what the US did, but what about the other countries? They didn't just sit back idly and do nothing. There was a trade war, so they retaliated. So here, what I'm doing is just plotting instead of the average tariff, just showing you the cumulative increase in terms of the US exports that were hit by tariffs in retaliation. And it was, as I said, it wasn't just China, it was also Mexico, who we have a free trade agreement with, the EU, Turkey, Russia, and then this graph continues on, and you see there's already, like, just in 1 year, like about $140 billion of US exports hit by tariffs. And in fact, the average tariff on US exports to China quadrupled from about 5% to 20%. Okay, so why did the US do this? What was the objective? Well, so the stated objectives, there were economic objectives and other objectives, but as I've already hinted at, is to protect US jobs. Also to improve the terms of trade. So by that I mean trying to get countries like China to reduce their export prices even further. But there are other objectives as well, like to protect the value of intellectual property, economic security. There's the idea is to safeguard strategic industries like semiconductors and not be totally dependent on China. Also, environmental concerns. So there were, tariffs on solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, etc. Again, this was to try and promote the domestic production of green technologies. Okay, let's look at the data now. What happened? So I'm going to start with the stock market reaction. So here what we have is that I have a table that shows the date of the announcement date of every tariff, the tariff wave that was imposed. So, that first graph that I showed you with the different waves of tariffs, we went back to the newspapers to find the very first time it was mentioned that this tariff would be announced, and then we looked to see what happened to stock returns on those days. So the next column shows you what happened. So 0.3 there means that there was a 0.3% increase in the stock return, and I also indicate whether the tariff was imposed by the US or China, and a description of what happened. But even though that very first one is positive, what you see is most of them are negative. And the cumulative effect of all of those announcement dates at the bottom is minus 11.5. So the stock market fell 11.5%. So you might think, well, why? This is supposed to help the economy, help the firms. Obviously the market thinks something different. They're saying that, no, this is bad. And for China also, the China tariff announcements produced similar declines. So in order, again, to try and understand why this might be, again, we should go back to think about Max's insights that, there are all these different linkages. It's not just the firms that are directly importing from China that, are affected, or the ones that are competing directly, but, there's this complex chain of global chains that are affected. Just looking over, something messed up with my graph. Okay, it's still good. What this shows is what happened to the stock markets. So just looking at the dynamics on the days before the announcements and the days after. So that vertical line, which should be red, is the day before each of those announcements. And so what you see is the 5 days leading up to those tariff announcements that I just showed you in the previous table. There wasn't much action at all in the stock market. But the next day that is indicated 0, that's the day of the announcement. You see that indicates that 11.5% drop that I mentioned in the stock market. And one thing to note about this is that these declines were large and persistent. It's not like they just bounced back the next day or the day after. I'm showing you what it is 5 days out, and that fall is still evident. So there's really no evidence of overshooting. Another interesting fact is that the impact was very broad. So again, we may think that the only firms that were affected are those ones the firms that were directly exposed. And by directly exposed, I mean firms that were importing from China, exporting to China, or maybe have a foreign affiliate in China. So they were relatively more affected. But firms that weren't directly engaged with China also had negative effects. So what this, in the earlier tables I was showing you average effects, this is the whole distribution of the returns. So you see the blue one is the distribution of firms' returns on days where there was no tariff announcement. And you see it's centered around 0 and some plus and minus movements. But the red graph is on what happened to these firms on announcement days. And you see that whole distribution is shifted to the left. So, what this indicates is that, that there were very large losses, and not just for the firms that were directly affected, but, quite broad effects. Okay, what happened to imports? So what happened was that, so here I'm looking at import values, and I'm normalized everything to 1. The black line indicates products that did not have any tariff on them. All the other lines, they're the different waves of the products that were hit by the tariffs in that earlier graph that I showed you. So, so what you see is that the black line so the dash, the vertical dash is the announcement. So you see the black line just keeps going up, and so 1.25 indicates that there was a 25% growth in import values of those goods that were not hit by tariffs. But you see all the other lines are less than 1, which means that we basically shifted away from those goods, importing those goods that had tariffs on them. And then if you look at a graph on what happened to U.S. exports that were hit by tariffs, it follows a very similar pattern following the foreign retaliation. Okay, so here now what we're looking at is the similar graph, but instead of plotting import values, we're plotting import prices. These are the tariff-inclusive import prices. Again, the black line is the one where there were no tariffs on those products, and you see that after on the dates of the tariffs being imposed, import prices were falling because it's below 0, so it was a decline in those prices. Before the tariffs, they were all kind of moving in relatively similar ways. But what you see is that all the other lines are above that 0 with increases of about, the 0.2 indicates like a price increase of about 20%. Now, if we had the terms of trade gains that we were hoping for, you wouldn't see that big increase in the tariff-inclusive price. It would be, what you would see is that the export prices fell, and even then with the tariff, that they would be similar before. So, what the evidence actually showed, more systematic evidence, is that basically China did not reduce its prices at all. So the US consumers basically bore the full cost of the tariff. So, if there was a 10% tariff, the prices import prices went up by 10%, and the government collected that tariff revenue, but it did come from the consumers, and then the production and consumption decisions were distorted. Okay, so that was import prices, but what happened to other prices, domestic prices? So did these changes in the import prices pass through to the domestic prices? So I'll first just look at just one particular example. So I showed you that one of the first areas to be hit was like the washing machines. So this shows the price of major appliances, the consumer price index of major appliances. And the red vertical dash is the date that the tariffs were imposed on those tariffs. So you can see washing machine prices and other appliances were going down over the few years leading up to it. But then soon as the tariff was imposed, the prices jumped up, and you can see there's about a 10% increase in the prices. So that's just one example, but again, looking at more systematic evidence based on some research that I did. What we did was we looked at what happens to U.S. manufacturing prices in the U.S. after the trade war, and what we found was that they were 1% higher because of the U.S. Tariffs. And so then just looking into what were the driving forces of this price increase, so there were the two main effects. One is that the higher import prices meant that domestic producers can increase their prices, the markup effect, also called a strategic complementarity. So they had less foreign competition, so they could increase their prices without having to lose market share. This was about 1/5 of the effect, so about 20%. The other effect, much bigger effect, the other 4/5, was this intermediate input cost, or the marginal cost effect. The tariffs were imposed on many intermediate inputs, and So the prices where those intermediate inputs were imposed, they increased much higher than industries that didn't face that. So overall, what this suggests is that firms faced lower effective rates of protection from the tariffs, and that's because that second effect dominates. And you know, again, to emphasize Max's insight, like to understand the effects of these tariffs, we really have to take into account both the output and the input effect. Okay. All right, so the main one that people have been talking about is employment effects. So now I want to turn to look at the evidence as to whether there were any employment gains from the tariffs. So I'll just start off with a little, some anecdotal evidence on looking at the steel tariffs. Now, I wanted to start with this because there have been tariffs on steel for decades, many decades. And I think, yeah, this goes back to mid-90s. So, you know, what these lines show is the percent of the trade that, that had some kind of protection. So what you see is that, with China, nearly 100%, this is even before the trade war, because this stops at 2017, nearly, you know, almost all of Chinese steel is hit with some kind of tariff already before the trade war, and also for the rest of the world as well. About more than 60% of the rest of the world steel has been hit by tariffs for a long time. So, you know, so I think this is a good case study because, you know, if they've had so much protection for so many years, you know, we should be able to see some job creation. Before I show you the employment numbers, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of where the U.S. steel comes from. So the light bars is the share of imports by each of those countries in 2017, before the trade war started, and then the darker bars are 2023. So I want you to zoom in on the red one, which is China. So you see, we're only importing like 3% of our steel from China. Most of it comes from the EU and Canada. So. Okay, so what happened to employment? So in this plot, so the red line shows you what's happened to production since 1990 up until the current period, and the blue line shows you employment. So one thing to note is that in 2023, the US produced a unit of steel with half as many workers as in 1990. I mean, you can see, like, you know, how much we produce hasn't changed very much, but the number of workers we need to produce that same amount is much to most of this is because of technological change. You know, the mini mills and other technological change that you just don't need as many workers to produce steel. So we did the kind of a back of the envelope calculation to say, well, you know, like in the last decades, there are about 35,000 fewer jobs in the steel industry. What would it cost to save those jobs? And what we calculated was that the cost per job is $232,000. Which is 4 times the average wage of a steel worker. So there are a couple of things to think about from this graph. I know that there's a lot going on, but one is that, you know, we don't really see any, you know, the job creation we were hoping for by protecting this industry. But, you know, it could be that maybe it would have been even lower had we not had the tariffs. You know, we don't know the counterfactual. But even if there were jobs protected, you know, how much are we prepared to pay to protect those jobs? You know, how much does it cost the economy? And you know, our finding is that, you know, it costs 4 times the salary that they would be getting. So what about so that was kind of anecdotal because it was just looking at some plots from one industry. But there have been more systematic, rigorous research done on looking at whether the trade war actually created jobs. So there have been two main approaches. One is by looking at regions in the US of regions that are more exposed to tariffs to ones that had industries that weren't so exposed. And what that study found is that really the regions that had more protection, more exposure to tariffs, there was no employment change due to those tariffs at all. But looking at the retaliatory tariffs, okay, so when US exports were hit, they did find that then there were employment losses in those industries. It was mostly agriculture because the US exports a lot of agriculture, and the government did try to give subsidies to try to offset some of those losses, but that only partly offset the effects. There were still losses in those industries. Another approach is to look at manufacturing industries. As we saw, some industries were more affected than others. It wasn't all products hit by the same amount. And there, this study found that there were actually negative effects. So those industries that had more tariffs, that were supposed to get more protection, actually had losses. And they ascribed that the reason for that is that any possible positive effect, the potential positive effect from the protection was offset by these negative effects on the higher input costs that I've been emphasizing, and also the retaliatory tariffs that China and other countries have been imposing. Now, these are all at the industry level. There haven't been any studies at the firm level. I think it'd be interesting to look at individual firms, to see if any of them, and this is something I'm working on at the moment, but unfortunately I didn't have those results for you today. The research out there has not found any evidence of job creation from these tariffs. Okay, so just looking at sorry, I was just checking the watch. So one of the other objectives was to protect intellectual property. There was this concern that Chinese firms are stealing US intellectual property, stealing secrets. So the idea was to put tariffs on to try and coerce them to stop doing that. But one thing to note is that the complexity of the supply chains. So what this figure is showing is that in China there are a lot of multinationals, and a lot of them are the US. So some of the main industries that were hit, like the computer and electronic products, 87% of the firms producing electronic products in China are actually not Chinese firms. They're actually multinationals. So when the US imposes tariffs on these products, they're actually hurting their own firms that are have affiliate sales in China, and you see that the red bars are the non-Chinese shares. So it's very complex, and it's very difficult to target just one area where you want to get that gain because of these complex global supply chains. Okay, so far I've been talking about costs. You might be wondering, the title did say winners as well. So are there any winners? So let's just have a look to see if there were. So here what I'm showing is the market shares by country in the US, the change in the market share from before the trade war in 2017 compared to the trade war in 2023. So the first thing that should jump out at you is the red bar, China. So you see that they've had a big drop in their market share in the US, as you would expect with these very high tariffs hitting them. But, other countries have gained. As we talked earlier, it's not that if you put a tariff on China, that consumers are going to automatically switch to US-produced goods. They may seek other, low-cost foreign suppliers. And in fact, the biggest winners, as you can see from this graph, are countries like Mexico and Vietnam. So I'm ready to conclude. So the US tariff raised US import prices proportionally. We didn't see evidence of those terms of trade gains that was hoped for. US producers responded to this lower import competition by raising prices. Many groups in the US experienced losses, as we saw. Workers in industries more exposed to tariffs experienced job losses. Consumers paid higher prices, firms pay higher prices for inputs, and then they incur costs of searching for new suppliers. And as you saw, the stock prices kind of plummeted. But some countries did gain market share in the US by replacing the Chinese exports to the US, countries like Vietnam and Mexico. But these were at higher prices than the pre-China price. And this is kind of one of the concerns that, there could be distortions in production and consumption. So the punchline is that it's really difficult to extract gains from imposing tariffs, mostly because of very complex global supply chains, and also foreign countries retaliate. That concludes my talk. Thank you.
All right, just one more thing we need to do before we wrap up. Just give Mary a small gift for presenting the lecture tonight. All right, so that concludes the lecture tonight. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the 2025 Corden lecture as well. So thank you.